Okay, so for this video I'd like to address something quite recent and topical, and that is the topic of President Trump's prejudice or lack of same. And of course I'm referring mainly to the recent comments he made regarding immigration from certain countries. And rather than use the profanity he did, I will refer you to the text here. So the discussion between lawmakers in President Trump's Oval Office was about immigrants from Haiti, El Salvador, African countries, and they were trying to work on a deal between Democrats and Republicans. And then Trump said the following, as you can see it there. Why are we having all these people from, expletive deleted, countries come here? He then suggested the United States should instead bring more people from countries such as Norway, and he also mentioned Asian countries because he felt they would help the United States economically. Alright, so the main criticism of these comments, apart from the language used, has been that they are racist. Well, to understand the comments we need to look at the what and the why. What did he actually say in terms of its meaning, and why did he say it? Well, the first thing to notice about the S-hole word is that it refers in common parlance to a place, not to people or individuals. If you want to refer to people in a derogatory and similar fashion, the A-hole word is the one that is preferred. S-hole refers indeed to places. You might hear travellers talk about a certain place they've been as an S-hole. If the place was underdeveloped, dysfunctional and or mired in corruption. So in this context, talking about countries, a country that is underdeveloped, dysfunctional, especially in its government, and or mired in corruption, is the kind of place that people don't enjoy visiting, and the people who live there may not enjoy being citizens of those countries either. Sometimes they themselves might call the place they live by a similar word when they're angry about what's happening in their region. Alright, so the word, although you might say that word is particularly offensive, it is a word that, generally speaking, refers to a place, not to the people itself, but often to the systems in a place, the amenities, educational standards, standards of law and order, and so on. So why did he say this? Why did he say this about these countries, Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries? We're not told which ones were being discussed in particular, perhaps generally. Well, the reason he said a word that implies that those nations are underdeveloped, dysfunctional and or mired in corruption is probably because for many of those countries, probably most of them, it is in fact true that they are underdeveloped, dysfunctional and or mired in corruption. But the claim is that he said this only because he's a racist and that really brown skin was the problem. Okay, and so we have many quotes from CNN and other outlets talking about his aversion to black and brown countries. Was skin tone the problem? Is that why he characterised these nations in that way? Well, we already have a perfectly sensible explanation for what many of those nations, or almost all of them, have in common, and that is their stage of development, their dysfunctionality, the unpleasantness of them for people who live there in many cases. Why would we need to bring race into it? Well, in the modern environment that's almost impossible to avoid. But the problem with this particular narrative is that the President also gave the tick, if you like, in terms of countries that he didn't consider to be S-holes. He gave the tick not only to Norway but also to Asian countries. Now, Asian people are not white. They also have various tones of skin colour, from brown to quite dark, light brown to quite dark, and so clearly skin tone, or the amount of melanin that they possessed, was not the key issue for President Trump. Also, it's worth noting that El Salvador and Haiti are racially quite different. One is mainly Latino, the other mainly African in background. But what these countries do have, many of the African countries, and El Salvador and Haiti, what they have in common is a long tradition, if you like, of social and economic dysfunction, and of course that would have implications for educational standards for the immigrants from those countries, at least on average. Of course there'd be exceptions. None of this means that the people from there are bad people, and one can acknowledge these dysfunctions in the countries and the fact that many of them would be unpleasant places to live, which is the implication of what Trump said, without thereby criticising the people themselves or their personality or character. Now here's the problem. Knowing about the Asian comments and the racial heterogeneity of the characterised nations that Trump referred to as SLs, given that we have other things, obvious things, in common between the insulted countries, makes the racism charge not merely wrong, but it would seem deliberately dishonest. You have to actually ignore outright the reference to Asian countries, ignore outright the fact that El Salvador and Haiti are in fact different racially, ignore outright the fact that the countries insulted have a lot of other things in common more than race, to do with social and economic dysfunction. Now, there's really no excuse for ignoring these things because they are, if you like, manifest, obvious. And so one is moving further from, shall we say, mistaken logic towards what looks like deliberate dishonesty and manipulation. Now, here's another challenge that was given out, another few words from one of the CNN journalists. Listen to this.
Shithole countries.
The idea that all countries in Africa are shitholes. News tonight, word that the president today disparaged immigrants coming from what he called shithole countries, referring to African nations.
He wants it based on bringing in the best.
So why is he
and
talking
the
about
brightest.
shithole countries? Is there any predominantly white or Caucasian country that the president has called a shithole?
Okay, so I'll stop it there because that was the section that I thought was most important. Is there any country that the president has criticised or characterised in that particularly rude and crude way? Well, the problem with that objection is, of course, we have a sample size of one comment, which makes this a meaningless observation. We only have one example, one conversation where he's used this word to describe some countries. And so, given we only have one conversation to base it on, then with a sample size of one, we can't make an observation about whether President Trump ever has or ever would refer to a white nation in this disparaging fashion. So that's the first thing. With a sample size of one, to note that no white nation was listed is rather pointless and stupid. But there's another problem. In fact, given what we know of President Trump's background as a New York billionaire, we can have little doubt that he would have called much of Eastern Europe under communism similar names for similar reasons in just a couple of decades ago, if we are honest. So if we're going to be honest about this, really think about what a man with Trump's background would say about, say, Bulgaria before the wall fell, that changed everything in Eastern Europe. Before that, Bulgaria would have been dysfunctional, socially, economically, a very unpleasant place to live. It would have had a great deal of corruption, the way Communist Party run places usually work, involves a lot of corruption. And of course, if somebody like President Trump had visited a highly underdeveloped place like Bulgaria was in those days, he would have not enjoyed it, and he would have probably under his breath perhaps privately, to others close to him, described it in disparaging, very disparaging fashion. So the fact that he didn't list a white nation as an S-hole nation in that particular conversation proves nothing. Alright, so am I defending President Trump? Well, here's the thing. No. I'm only defending him from the racial prejudice charge. I'm calling this video Trump's prejudice with a question mark because if there is a prejudice, I don't think it's racism. And there is quite a bit to criticise about what Trump said. But it's not racism. The racism thing is just an easy go-to for these people who are criticising him. It requires very little thought, and it's something they can jump to as a kind of easy weapon to beat him with. But in fact they need to think a bit more deeply. The first thing I should note is that, of course, there's, if you like, the minor problem, that the language was crude, rude, and irresponsible in that context. There was always a chance that language would get out and offend people from other nations, even if some of them actually agreed that their own nation was deeply dysfunctional and a bit like living in a toilet. So it was crude, it was rude, it was irresponsible. But that's the minor problem. The major problem is actually an assumption which is not being made enough of. And that is the assumption that, which was effectively falling, which was lying behind these comments, which we looked at before, that immigration should be allowed only if there is more benefit than cost to the nation. Now, I think in most cases, most people would agree that that is true, that most immigration should be permitted if there is more benefit than cost to the nation. So immigration shouldn't be a net cost to a nation under normal circumstances. So when it comes to normal immigration, people asking to come in, they don't have an automatic right to enter and become citizens. So the nation has the right to ask that people who do come in don't cost the nation more than they benefit the nation. So because there is no right to emigrate, any more than anybody has a right of entry into your private house, then it's reasonable for the host nation to set conditions. But we are morally obliged to accept some immigrants sacrificially. In other words, when there is more cost than benefit to the nation, in case of genuine need, in accordance with the principle of the Church's moral theology and social teaching. That principle is the principle of the universal destination of goods. In other words, the good things of this present life are meant to be distributed to everybody. Everybody should have their share, if you will, and access to the goods of this life, the good things of this life in a physical sense. And when we are dealing with a situation, for example, of genuine refugees, and not all the people that were being talked about in this conversation were actual refugees, some of them might have been accepted into America provisionally while their country was a mess, and their country is no longer in quite such a mess, and they're in no actual danger if they go back to that country. But many of the people who would have been talked about may have been, in fact, refugees. They might have been in danger of, say, persecution if they went back. But perhaps that doesn't apply as much to the African situation or to Haiti or El Salvador in this time, but it may have applied in the past. But when you are dealing with refugees, that is a situation where a nation does have a moral responsibility to people in that need to help them, even if that help costs the nation more than that particular group of people benefits the nation, at least in the short to medium term. This is precisely why wealthy nations should knowingly and voluntarily take some undereducated, traumatized people from horrible places. So the problem is not so much that President Trump was being racist in this case, it's that he assumed that immigration should almost always have a net benefit to the country taking those immigrants. Now, in normal cases, that is true. That should be the, if you like, default position. That is a reasonable thing for a nation to ask of its immigrants. And it may well be that where nations have a terrible tradition of corruption, poor education systems, poor amenities, radically different cultures, that these people from those nations may have great difficulty assimilating, great difficulty contributing. And so there may be, because they draw a lot of social welfare and so on, more cost than benefit to the nation, at least for some reasonable amount of time. Nevertheless, wealthy nations in particular have a responsibility to not just have what you might call an economically rational immigration program, but also a part of their immigration program devoted to what you might call charitable purposes. People who have to flee their original home, who are in dire need, they should get our help without doing cost-benefit analysis. So the third thing I'd note is if there is a prejudice here from President Trump, it's not racism but a kind of classism, though even that's uncertain given Trump's anti-elitist style. If there is a major fault, it is insufficient charity to the poor, in this, at least from this conversation. And that seems to be, this classism that I spoke of seems to be a far more likely prejudice for somebody with Trump's background. He's more likely, in other words, to be prejudiced against poor people, even if he doesn't realise it. However, I would note the following, and I don't know, I haven't confirmed this for myself, but apparently he has, in fact, from his own money, I can't find the reference here at the present, but he has, in fact, in the past, given money privately to Haiti to help that nation after the earthquake disaster. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note regarding possible classism is that, versus racism I should say, Trump apparently has no problem employing people of various races and praising their work. So we don't have evidence of racism really in his past. The evidence that has generally been put forward I have looked at and found to be wanting. But what we do have, I think, is the similar sorts of prejudices that you would expect many rich people to have, and especially those who consider themselves to have been a great success through their own efforts, at least partly. So, whilst I wasn't there for the conversation that has caused this firestorm of controversy, I do believe that Trump's comments were not racist, but very deficient in various ways morally. Now, it depends a little bit on what was being discussed at the time. If the part of the immigration program being discussed during this conversation was specifically related to, if you like, the non-charitable part of the immigration program, then that would put it in a somewhat different light. But it would appear that they were indeed dealing with a part of the immigration program most relevant to, if you like, immigration for those in most need. And the insensitivity of President Trump's response to that is problematic. And that's all I've got to say about that at present.